Good morning, everybody, and thank you to our panelists for agreeing to share their experience on the first of a six-part series of webinars we have. My name is Dixon Liao, Principal Technology Leader at ADVI, and I'll be your facilitator for today's webinar. So to begin, what we have is to explore an exciting topic today on infrastructure preparedness for connected and automated vehicles, as well as electric vehicles. But first, what do we have today? I shall share with you some of the current images of what we have today. As you can see, we've got all kinds of road infrastructure around Australia, around our cities, urban, extra-urban, rural, congestions everywhere. We have some open space, some really scenic, nice drives, but most of our majority of the day, Monday to Friday, we do get into the congestion, we get into some gridlocks. So to begin, I shall ask the panelists in some of the series of questions in today's seminar. But before I begin, just to remember to all our listeners out there, there is a two-question poll that we have for you. So as you listen through the conversation, think about the two questions. The first question is about what are the barriers to uptake the autonomous vehicle being introduced in Australia? And the other one is what do you think, when do you think highly automated and self-driving transport will become a commonplace? So these polls will be taken in the next 5 minutes, and then we will share the polls during the session at the end. So, panelists, the year is 2032. Automated and electric transportation are widely available to use as either part of mobility or as a private vehicle in which we could own. With that in mind, could you share with us maybe your persona in 2032? I'll start with you, Brian.
Well, my name's Brian Haratzis. I'm the owner of Global Mobility. It's a platform technology, so I've privatised mobility and the sale of mobility, and you can, for $300 a month, you can actually be part of my platform. I protect you from cybersecurity, I insure you, and I give you mobility on any form of transport. So I've got a mobility as a service platform, and from my perspective, I'm wanting not just the public sector, but the private sector to produce component parts for me so I can own your mobility.
Thank you, Brian. Carola, could you share with us what your persona will be at 2032?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Carola Jonas. In 2032, I'll be working for Fuse Energy as the head of decentralization, and I guess this is where we need to look at, with all these cars being distributed energy resources, how are they charged, how does that interface with the infrastructure and obviously the energy demands. And as the grid is changing and becomes more decentralized and we have more microgrids, that's where we'll be working in.
Thank you. No, that's very good. That would be very good to have some energy and discussion amongst all the technologies and what have you. And yourself, Dean?
Dean. I am the Chief Engineer at Future Motor Corporation, which was formed out of the ashes of several conventional motor manufacturers, but has been reborn. People like Brian are actually some of our best customers. We make vehicles of all types. Virtually all the fleet is now autonomous. We have a small boutique business for people who insist on driving their own cars, but they're not allowed on the road. They have to go to special private places to drive, just like people riding horses. We make many different kinds of vehicles. There are still some people who want to own their own cars, and they're autonomous, but we see that's actually a declining market, and actually the growing market is companies like Brian's taking our vehicles and using them as a service, and basically they're moving rooms.
Thanks for that, Dean. That was a good insight. And finally to you, Michael.
I'm Michael Caltabiano. It's great to be here, Dixon. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Transport Research Organisation for Australia and New Zealand. And we've just, over the last decade, invested the federal government's $300 million a year that they chose to start investing in 2018 into 6 test beds across Australia to enable a connected and automated future for the country. So we have provided the science and the rigour to allow Brian and his team and the private sector to utilise those test beds to enable the future, to grow the economy. And what we've seen over the last decade is, in fact, the investment of that money quadrupled in terms of the size of the growth of the economy, delivering next generation jobs, software jobs and global skills. So it's a real success story based on that government investment and enablement that comes with the testbed environment for Australia and New Zealand.
Thanks, Michael. That's actually a very, very important point to enable the test beds and enable the different testing requirements for this technology. So without further ado, I will, with all your personas in place at 2032, I'll kick off with the first question. What do we mean by infrastructure? What do you think is the optimal infrastructure to allow for future mobility? Do we need to build it? Do we need to modify it? Or do we just assume and expect the vehicle to adapt to it? Maybe I can start with you, Brian.
Well, the optimal infrastructure for the future is actually consumer orientated. It's got nothing to do with the existing infrastructures. What I'm interested in doing is making sure that every person in Australia has access, and that includes people from 11 years old, because from 11 years old, of course, you're allowed in any automated vehicle to take you to any place. I want my infrastructures to be able to accommodate disabled people, older people, impaired vision. So in 2018, it was really interesting when we started this company, because actually there's about 40% of the population couldn't get on public transport, couldn't actually move from their homes, totally isolated. What I've been able to do is to, in effect, sell the idea to government that I can create a platform, but you have to help me to join the dots.
That's an interesting point they've got there. Thanks for that. Other panels, maybe Carola?
Yeah, sure. So I guess when I look at it from my point, electricity is the new fuel, and we're probably not going to go to petrol stations any longer because electricity is widely available everywhere. And it's really when you speak to EV drivers today, they're actually saying, it's the best thing that they do not have to go to petrol stations anymore. They just plug in at work, at home overnight. It's a no-brainer. You don't even need to think about it. And I guess that's where, in the long term, the future will take that whole part from drivers away completely. You do not need to think about how the electricity gets into your car, because the car is actually looking after that itself. So there'll be some infrastructure, provision of electricity, and the cars dealing with that. And you, as a consumer, you just have an annual subscription, and you don't need to worry about anything.
Dixon, it is interesting, though, that in my fleet, I've got a mix of EV and traditional internal combustion. And the reason for that is the price of fuel came down dramatically. As EV started to take off, the fuel companies realised that this is not a zero-sum game here. And it's been very interesting. So I've still got mechanics, traditional mechanics as it were, and I've got electrical people that really understand software. So for me, it's been quite difficult and confusing. I've been at the government for a while. I don't know what your research organisation is doing, asking them, when are we going to straighten out? Which way are we going to go here? Because it's costing us all a fortune.
Well, Brian, we have a lovely museum, and so when those cars become redundant, which is very soon, we have room.
But the infrastructure question, you're right to challenge, Brian, because we're on this journey of understanding what intelligent mobility means. Because it's actually not a journey about the vehicle. The vehicle and the automation in the vehicle and the move to electric, even maybe a hydrogen future, is happening. But how is the infrastructure responding? How are we engaging with an intelligent mobility outcome? We need to understand the demand side much more than we currently do. It's not about building bigger roads and more roads. It's about understanding the mobility journey of a community and then matching what the actual vehicle arrangement is to suit the mobility journey. So we've actually got to turn the question around. And that's what the fundamental issue for infrastructure requirements are going to be. Now that we understand the electric vehicle, we understand a connected and automated future, and we've had our test beds, as part of that journey, we've really understood this intelligent mobility future, and we're going to change the infrastructure mix. It's got to be fundamentally different. It's a different journey for the community now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. From hearing what you guys are saying, it is not just about the technology of the vehicle per se. It needs to be the holistic approach in terms of from energy. It seems as if the roads and infrastructure needs to get smarter, as what Michael also mentioned. It's about the journey. It's about the user, the consumer's point of view. I think that's quite important.
That's where platforms like Brian's or ours actually come in, because we will know all of that without even needing to manage it. It will all be artificial intelligence and algorithms figuring out when energy or other infrastructure has to be available for the cars.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. For me, seeing some of the trials and some of the proof of concepts that we had in 2018, I can understand some of the upskill that is necessary for the infrastructure. So that's very interesting. How about yourself, Dean? Do you have anything to add?
Well, since we have to build the things that run around on whatever infrastructure is there, yes, I'd love to say something. So first of all, the 7G network has been really helpful. Our autonomous vehicles are obviously autonomous, so they can operate without any connectivity. However, they're not very efficient if they do so, and it's far better if they're connected all the time. The other thing is we don't bother making internal combustion engines anymore. That's really not worth it.
No, but we've been purchasing from China because despite what they said about EV, the ICE motors are still less expensive.
Yeah.
And of course, open source automated driver systems have meant that these are very inexpensive vehicles, as you know. We buy some widgets off you.
Yes.
But the Australian versions are relatively expensive and they haven't got all the components that we need.
So we have vehicles that we know of which were built in 2018 and have done 7 million kilometres, and basically we just have to change the seats because nothing wears out. So the depreciation on these electric vehicles is minimal. So there's a completely different cost equation. So if you look at the total cost of ownership, those ICE vehicles are like disposable razors or something. They're very expensive. So we don't bother building them. But I'm glad you're getting your money's worth. In terms of infrastructure, like we as a vehicle manufacturer can't wait for the infrastructure to be right. We have to build the vehicles. And so now our vehicles can deal with anything. It doesn't really matter. They're actually better than people in every situation we have tested. However, in the early days when the vehicles were not that smart, it was incredibly helpful that the government had actually spent a little bit of money making automated vehicle lanes, doing something about in busy places, making the signs consistent, making sure that there were actually some charging infrastructure in the days when batteries could only go 400 kilometres.
And I like your correct assumption that now it's 7G, but in 2018 it required government to have a national policy to implement 5G right across the country, just like the European nations are doing. Make a conscious decision, get out of the flotsam and jetsam of DSRC, CITS, and just take the leap, make it 5G so that we can progress on this journey to a 7G future. Enabling infrastructure for a connected and automated fleet.
Yeah, and look, as I say, the AVs, to be totally fail-safe, must operate safely and correctly without any connectivity whatsoever. But if you do that, you lose efficiency. There are some safety situations which you just can't deal with. So the ideal for us is that you are always connected. And then the other part of it is, now that people don't have to actually pay attention to the driving task at all, these really are moving rooms. And they can be a hotel room to sleep in, they can be an office, they can be a boardroom, whatever. So you've got to have connectivity as if it's a fixed network.
As long as you don't get motion sickness, of course.
No. Our vehicles have self-stabilising, so you don't even know they're moving.
But the vehicle that we like most from Future Motor Vehicle is the, it's almost, if you went back to 2018, it looks like a tram, but it's actually an automated bus that runs on road. I mean, because what people forgot in 2018 was that, of course, there was mode shift out of public transport. Government stopped investing in public transport, so there was no trunk infrastructure.
Yes.
And so Dean's company built this vehicle, which so now our platform, we own most public transport by virtue of running Dean's vehicles on the road now. And what then happened was that we actually had to work with government because we became such a monopoly to develop a community service obligation. So Dean's company then had to begin to work through how is it that these articulated, I guess you could call them buses, but in those days they're probably trams. I don't know what you call them.
Shuttles.
Yeah, but they were bigger, and they're on demand, and they essentially connect communities.
Yeah.
But what happened as a result of this is that the public sector started to get out of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of unintended consequences.
Well, it's a very interesting discussion that we had, and actually we've got a question from the listeners as well, which I'll actually ask to the panel. So this is a question from Mike, where he says, what does it mean for country Australians? And actually I'll use that and think about, imagine this, if we are in remote Australia, somewhere between Alice Springs and Darwin, a person had this, vehicle, connected, automated, and there's a electrical storm. And as we know, some electrical storms, such as some of those that we've seen, the one in 100 years, where you can knock out a lot of the infrastructure from the electricity grid and what have you. What does this mean for those, drivers or those passengers in those vehicles, in those remote area? How do we ensure that we mitigate and prepare for situations such as this? And I would like to maybe hear, maybe from yourself, Michael, what are some of the preparedness that we need to have in order to mitigate those risks?
Well, that's exactly why we have the suite of test beds across Australia. So, we have an urban test bed in Melbourne and Fisherman's Bend, which really looks at a future mobility space for capital cities. And we've invested in New South Wales and rural and regional New South Wales 2 or 3 test beds to exactly answer that question. How to connect rural and regional Australia, how to make sure that they're not disconnected from a technology-enabled future. And that's why I threw in a hydrogen alternative to electric, a clean energy source as a potential future, because our test beds have shown that you can't have the same levels of connectivity in rural and regional Australia. It is not going to happen in a cost-effective, efficient manner unless Dean's company or Brian's company has a technological solution that enables that to happen.
Well, we do have a preference. We're not keen on the hydrogen economy because it's clumsy and difficult to deal with, and we think electric is the way to go. And in regional Australia, where you may be off grid or the grid connectivity is not as reliable as in the city, we feel the correct solution is solar with huge batteries. And if you've got the grid, that's great, but you can survive on the solar if you need for basic essential services. When it comes to connectivity, the major carriers now have many years ago purchased Space Cube technology, so we have low Earth orbit satellites. So an alternative to the terrestrial network is basically some very low delay, well-priced satellite technology, which is really the best answer in very, very low density areas we've discovered.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dean here. I guess on-demand electricity generation through solar and batteries can be rolled out in all areas of Australia, in any remote areas. If you look at what happens, obviously, in the Kimberley region, Northern Territory, when the wet season hits, it's easier to actually switch on a little solar charger than bringing petrol around the country where parts of the country isn't even accessible. So I guess on-demand, immediate electricity generation for the cars, and we've got no problem.
Well, locally generated when you need it,
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting question, because we just got a question from Professor David, where he's actually asking a very similar question about the feasibility and the ease of changing batteries compared to charging batteries. What do you say about that, Dean?
So maybe back in 2015, people thought that was a good idea, and Better Place tried that.
What's this, the drop in, drop out?
Drop in, drop out. And at the time, with the technology and the charging times, that made a lot of sense. But because of these guys, the battery technologies just leapt forward, and billions and billions of dollars went into battery technology. And we're now at the point where the energy densities are pretty much the same as petrol. So it doesn't really matter. And around about 2020, the Europeans, way back then, introduced 650 kilowatt charging, which meant like Porsche and Mercedes could get 80% charged 400 kilometres in about 6 or 7 minutes.
So not much longer than filling a petrol tank today.
A cup of coffee time, if that.
And it's real, isn't it? I mean, it's, as you say, it's, in fact, in 2032, it's old technology, because by 2018, 2020, they were already just about there.
We're down to basically 2 minutes, and if you're lucky enough to be near one of the supercapacitor stations, it can dump the current, and it's the only limitation is just how cool can we keep the wires.
We did a major deal with the battery companies as part of the platform, and the reason is that when we're selling our mobility, we're actually selling energy at the same time, and so people are actually subsidising. And so we found globally, working with Corolla's company, that every day the car's actually adding power into the grid. You're coming home in the evening, it's powering a dwelling. So the whole of the mobility platform, really became much more important than Facebook and Amazon and those other kinds of platforms, because this actually is a lifestyle controlling platform.
Well, in a sense, you're not really paying for the energy, because the solar it's asymptote to zero. So
Correct.
what you're paying for is the clever management of that energy and the delivery of it.
That's exactly right. And so, fortunately through Michael, we've got 1,000 of the AI specialists in the world, because the whole plan of global mobility was to set up in Sydney, where we had the software people, but export knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the export of knowledge, and that's the infrastructures that really...
The global skills. The global
Absolutely.
skills that come from having a testbed environment where the private sector can develop the next economy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But
It's our
I
future.
hope that knowledge was embodied in a repeatable product, as opposed to people just consulting.
Well, that's why the private sector is developing the tools, the intellect, the software solutions
Well, it was
in an
difficult.
environment.
It was very difficult, because we went to the universities, and there was around 2018 all these problems with universities accepting funding for all kinds of research, and we went to the universities. They didn't like our technology. We went to Michael's operation and we said, we don't want to own the AI. We want to be able to produce it in the future, and of course only AI people can produce AI knowledge or develop knowledge. And so we did it. It was interesting in Australia. It was one of the smart things that we did.
So Brian, from what I'm hearing from the panelists, it sounds as if, from a barriers point of view, it's not the technology, it's not a power supply, it's not about the energy. So what do you guys think could be a barrier that we've experienced since 2018 to what we have now in 2032? What was some of the most difficult hurdles that we have to jump across?
The first barrier that we had to overcome was the engagement of government to actually, Australia's a federation, to actually getting our governments to think as one, because we can't create the railway lines of the 1900s. We have to create the digital highways, which are completely uniform and of one across Australia. So that was the initial hurdle, was to get them to act collegiately and of one voice and have national leadership in this space. Without that, none of this would have happened.
Yeah.
And that was the pivotal moment to change the whole paradigm for Australia.
No, thanks for that, Michael.
So for us, the initial products we made were expensive, because there was a huge amount of R&D that went into them, and the volume was fairly low. And one of the things about autonomous vehicles and even EVs is, until you've used them and experienced them, you just don't know how compelling they are. They're big, scary things. You don't know the depreciation curves. So what was really helpful was basically tax breaks and government incentives, state and federal, and even some councils, forward-thinking councils, Waverley Council, those kinds of guys, getting the threshold up so that lead users, could basically start to use these things, and also showing the public what was possible. And that was just enough to get the demand up. And then as the volume increased, we could drop the price and it was more attractive to people.
Yeah.
But it was very difficult. And the market alone, I do not think, would have done that. And for us, we're a global corporation headquartered in the US. We love Australia, we like coming here, it's a lovely place to go, but honestly, it's rounding error in our sales, right? So it was only that the Australian government and state governments were really making an effort that made us notice it.
The other big thing for me was the behaviour change that was required in the community, from a buy the infrastructure, buy the widget vehicle model, to using Dean's company and Brian's company to provide the fleet. So if I wanted to go away for a weekend and wanted a connected and automated vehicle that was four-wheel drive or whatever, I could get it.
Yeah.
If I wanted to go to work, I can pool with another half a dozen people in my street to go to a destination. So that behaviour change is a really significant step change in the process, which enabled the private sector to really offer what the community wanted.
Well,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, Brian.
No, that's okay. It was because just to make this happen, we had to develop what we call a social license marketing segment, because to get people to believe that, one, the safety was really there, two, that privacy was looked after, huge barrier. I mean, back in 2018, you won't believe this, but there was a view that nothing had to change for automated vehicles to be introduced with the privacy laws. Can you believe that? It's unbelievable. But of course, that didn't get up. But, but in terms of cybersecurity, we had to convince people that in a cybersecurity terrorist situation that they were going to be safe.
Yeah.
And we spent years, and we still spent large parts of our marketing budgets really getting people to sort of look at this and say, yes, it's not just, it works for us at that level, but actually it's a great contribution to the community because it's low carbon emission. We've got less vehicles on the road in total. It's way more equitable. I mean, if you're on a low income, you can actually get a job in the CBD. Wow, we used to think it was normal. But in 2018,
well, it used to be $70 of tolls in Sydney to get to your job.
I can remember that. Yeah. That was just unbelievable.
The other big outcome.
Well, now it's just pay as you go, right?
Yeah,
the other big outcome is the safety outcome. And what we learnt was in 2015, the average age of a vehicle in which there was a fatality was 13.5 years. In 2016, it was 13.9 years. In 2017, it was 14.1 years.
Yeah.
So those
the older
ICE
fleet
Chinese
were
probably in those
directly correlated to the fatality rates. So the step change in moving from a personally owned fleet to a modern, high safety outcome, corporately owned fleet substantially changed the safety case.
Yeah.
So we now don't have a fatality rate that's even measurable.
Correct.
It's so
And
small.
on top of that, you just mentioned all these autonomous cars. They're like a lounge room on wheels, and you get to like work on your computer. You do stuff. That has enabled a whole new industry. Like when smartphones were launched, no one knew that every business would have an app at some stage because we didn't know what the app concept even meant. So in your lounge room on wheels, you have all these infotainment, entertainment, extra services building whole new economies and businesses that can service the customer even more in that space.
It is about the whole paradigm shift of the consumer.
That's all it's about.
It's also about the business model that the commercial entities need to take into account, and the transition phase that they had since 2018 to what we have now and beyond. It's very, very important.
It is, but I just want to make this clear. We have some fundamental differences with future motor vehicle. I mean, that's relatively expensive. At the end of the day, there has to be there are fatalities, and there always will be. I mean, let's get real about this. So,
can I need to stop you. I really need to stop you.
I know. So, we need to get inexpensive, and we shot for the bottom here.
Yeah, no, okay, there's a few things I want to pick up. So one of the reasons Future Motor Corporation actually bothered here, there were, because of the vestiges of the Australian car industry, there was some real talent here, some excellent designers and fundamentally different thinkers. If it had not been for them and the government helping those people get into new roles, we probably wouldn't have been here as much as we are. To go to your point about safety, that really concerns me. Looking at the statistics as the AV technology has been rolled out and got better and better, we basically don't think we've had a single death that could be attributed to the AV system.
Well, just on that, just remember, in 2018 when this all started, there was a view that with automated driving systems, there didn't need to be any safety rating. There was no ANCAP. There was no institution in place that actually measured any of this. And so we went down the path of self-mandated outcomes.
Yes.
Everything we buy it complies. It's all legal.
So the way we dealt with that at the time there was a policy vacuum and a regulatory vacuum and a lack of standards. So our company mantra was do no harm. And so that has been our mantra from day one. And the way we dealt with that was when the early AV systems were not capable of dealing with all road situations. So like all AIs, as long as you constrain the problem the AI is solving, it will work very, very well. And in the early days, what was very helpful with the government, I mentioned things like autonomous vehicle lanes. Okay, the problem with the AVs is there are humans wandering around. And humans wandering around, humans are pretty good at guessing what a human's going to do. It took a long time for us to guess what humans were going to do using software, okay? And not only we got good enough at it, we really had to separate the AVs from random human beings. And that was where the infrastructure in the early days was very, very important. It allowed us to effectively offer light rail, but it didn't need rail. And so that was enough for us to start to amortise our R&D, to get the experience up, to get the sensor systems cheap enough. Because LiDAR, look, there was a fundamental breakthrough in 2020. The market started being flooded with these solid-state LiDARs. They're $200, or they were then. That's expensive now, I should say, right? They're about $2 now. But prior to that, the cheap ones were $7,000, and they were terrible. They were basically one-dimensional.
I've just got to stop you there, because in America they cop, you know, a decongested lane on a freeway, and they cop AV lanes. But in Australia, they would never cop that. It was always mixed fleet, and was always going to. We all knew that was always going to be a mixed fleet outcome, because socially that was just an unacceptable. And so, you know, we knew that our safety record, our 1,200 deaths, we knew we could probably get down to 100, but actually we accepted 600 deaths a year instead of 1,200. I mean.
It's interesting, Brian, that we lived through the same era and came away with a completely different viewpoint. And I think it's a tribute to both our companies that they're large enough that we can disagree so vehemently on fundamentals and yet still be good customers and vendors.
Oh, absolutely.
It's actually a very interesting discussion that we've sort of ventured slightly into, which is a good segue in terms of what I was thinking about the vulnerable road users. You
Yes.
know, with all this infrastructure that we're just talking about in terms of all this technology, are vulnerable road users, such as your pedestrian, your cyclists, your motorcyclists, part of this network that we're talking about?
Of course they are. It's fundamental. Do no harm.
Yeah. The whole of the testbed environment was predicated on a safe systems approach. So we really took the globally accepted safe systems methodologies of the 2015 to 2018 period and really put it on steroids, and end-to-end safe systems approach. You could not develop the next generation of either vehicle infrastructure or road infrastructure unless you did it through a safe systems paradigm. And that has fundamentally changed the way in which we do business in this country. And it's as Dean says, it's one of those behavioural changes that's led to a substantial change in the vulnerable road users being exposed.
Yeah.
That brings up another interesting point. So our do no harm mantra also applies to freight and goods, because you don't want to damage your goods. And actually the freight side of it surprisingly helped us get the passenger side of it right, because you can make a few more mistakes with freight than you can with humans. And so actually we discovered there was quite a large business for doing home deliveries, as long as the footpaths you could go very slowly and things like that, with little tiny robots that didn't scare people, and things like connecting to the Port of Melbourne. It turned out robot vehicles actually did a very good job. And then we discovered that rural and regional Australia, for an AV, that's actually quite a simple problem, because the roads are pretty straight, the GPS works very, very well, the visibility is usually very good, and so we actually found it was quite profitable automating trucking, and that actually allowed us to put more resources into the safety for passengers.
Well, I do remember the first platooning trial in 2019 in Australia, and the business case was really clear. Because the lead truck has a 5% fuel saving, the following trucks have about a 12% fuel saving. On average, right across the network for road trains, B-doubles and for semi-trailers, there's a $300 million fuel saving per year just through the platooning, safe platooning of the network, which decreased the cost to consumers and led to that journey to an electrified freight fleet. So it was a really interesting paradigm change in 2019.
So as a corporate person, 300 million means a lot, but as a human being, I see that as carbon that we didn't release.
We didn't release.
And the cost of goods sold reduced. So the cost of goods in the shops reduced.
Yeah.
We went down a completely different path for vulnerable users. I mean, we're a consumer-orientated organisation and platform, and so our view was, let's make sure that we can improve safety for every form of transport, because it's not just about an automated vehicle, it's about if you're walking and cycling. And so we developed technologies with Corolla's company which were interfaced, which work off watch, Apple Watch or Android Watch, so that it's a sensor, so that any motor vehicle that comes within any distance, it's a V2X sensor. So we started with the consumer and protecting the consumer, and that's what led us to have such a fantastic global platform. I mean, our
so
business
it's like a
is
guardian angel on your wrist.
Absolutely.
Or
business
in your
is,
pocket.
Our business is worth 5 times Facebook already.
Yeah, no.
Because we focused on the consumer.
just about go into receiver management around about 2023.
Yeah, part 10.
I think Snapchat bought them, didn't it?
I think so, because of the privacy problems that had been dogging it, I think, for over a decade.
Yeah, well, Snapchat, anyway.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Brian, because I was hoping that, Carola, you can chime in terms of, what does this mean with all the energy and what we're talking about with this vulnerable user? Would there be increase of the EMC, electromagnetic waves, with all this different energy that's coming through? What does it mean for something? I mean, Brian mentioned about this Guardian and what have you. That's all great, but is there any concerns from your point?
Not from the energy point of view. You will still transmit energy in the standard way. Of course, you also have like your wireless charging, but that's like transmitting energy over like very short distances, like right from the road to the car.
If you put your cheese in the middle, it might melt it.
Yeah, so you might want to look after your cats and dogs, but I don't see a problem for.
So it would be safe for Australians, what we're saying.
For us, yeah.
No, very good.
Actually, can I come back to the vulnerable road users and some stuff we've been looking at in the research labs, and also come around to the EMC part of it. In a previous life, I used to know a bit about that. So with the vulnerable road users, we've still found that not enough people actually have those wireless devices. So we thought, if the autonomous vehicles are capable of understanding the road situation, pedestrians, motorcycles, everything, well, why can't the roads do that? So we actually started a pilot project about 10 years ago where we were installing smart cameras with edge processing, with the lovely NVIDIA chips, which are now pretty slow, but were state of the art at the time. And those cameras basically understand all the objects moving on the road and anticipate problems. And so even if you're not wearing a watch, any of the AVs in the area can actually take action if there's something that they didn't notice. More than that, we actually did some experiments where the traffic lights honk at you and tell you to watch out and stuff like that. We found it's quite effective. So we're hoping that that's going to be something in infrastructure that is going to really make a difference and make sure that everybody on the road is absolutely protected.
Just to be clear for everyone, the issue has been that if you don't have your own device, you don't have insurance, and the insurance was a huge barrier for the implementation of automated vehicles. In fact, it's still a huge problem because no one ever anticipated how complex mobility would be, and all of the new cyber attack and the full range of things that occurs. So it's one of the very big product lines that Global Mobility has, selling private
it's interesting you should mention the cyber security part of it. So when we first came into this business, we realised that almost no thought had been given to making the communications with the autonomous vehicles secure, and so we actually had to develop architectures where certain components were completely isolated from the internet, except for very short periods of time where you had to do updates and stuff like that.
And that enabled the rural and regional environment to be enabled, to be disconnected and still function, which is super important.
Correct, because an autonomous vehicle cannot rely on the connection for safety. Actually, in 2018, it was 2017, if I can remember that far back, at one of the ITS World Congresses, the theme came up of what they call graceful exit. Graceful exit. So some of the early things like the shuttles, if they lost connectivity to their GPS correction, they just haul on the brakes and you get slammed onto the windshield. Most upsetting. The people in front were protected, but the people in the vehicle actually got smashed around.
I remember that because that was the conference that everyone thought there was no connection between energy and automated vehicles. I mean, it's funny. You look back at that and you think, how could you disassociate the two?
Well, even back then there was virtually no autonomous vehicle that wasn't electric. Pretty much every new autonomous vehicle was electric, right? It just seemed to be, even though it didn't necessarily have to be that way, that just happened. So,
what were the key things that happened, though? Yeah. How did we get this realisation that it was actually energy driven?
It is a very, very long time ago, and I think the market has just solved the problem by itself. Energy is the fuel. Energy will not help you with the cybersecurity and the safety level. So all of these things come together. And I guess what we've seen in energy, but also in all the other different parts, is that decentralization. Obviously, we all remember the early days when people started to work on blockchain in energy, peer-to-peer trading. I mean, that's like 20 years ago. This is the new normal. And so that the decentralization of energy, of connectivity and safety that just makes our system inherently safe now and your platform.
And it is also strange because the public sector's just about got out of it. It's like, fully self-mandated.
They were buggering up the market.
Is that right?
They were just buggering up the market.
Well, how did you see it then?
If we want a low carbon future, if we want to remove the human footprint from the planet, then we have to use a full renewable environment. And all of the research that's gone on and through Carolla's company has delivered that in the transport and mobility sector. And there's a lot more work to go on in other sectors.
It's an interesting point you've got there, Michael, because if that's the case, and then what we're saying, then on hindsight, back in 2018, should the government have spent billions and millions of dollars, looking into the infrastructure for all these advances in technology and energy and what have you? How could they or how should they have spent the money instead?
Well, it's fascinating because we as the National Transport Research Organisation were saying in 2018, you're spending as a country $26 billion on new works each year, building
Business
on the $270 billion national asset. It's the single biggest national asset's our road system. So we were saying back in 2018, you need to think smarter about your $26 billion investment. Are you building smart infrastructure or dumb infrastructure? And in 2018, 100% of the infrastructure was dumb infrastructure. So it required a massive change. And when led by our federal government, said we are going to invest in a testbed future to provide the guidance of what smart infrastructure looks like, that was the step change to lead us to where we are today. But without it, we'd still be building dumb infrastructure.
In a previous life, I had a bit to do with policy, and one of the things we tried to get up, unfortunately we didn't, was that 2% of every new infrastructure project went into research on how to do it cheaper and better in future. We're still hoping that will get up. So, for example, at $26 billion, that would liberate $500 million a year to put into research into how to build that infrastructure smarter, safer and better.
And in 2018, the spend on research into infrastructure was $10 million, not 500. So it was 0.001%.
Right. So
and that's the step change that happened.
So if we'd used cheaper paint on one of the tunnels, we would have had more money than that.
Correct.
And that's what led to the success of my business, because what happened was underinvestment in road, no investment in public transport, massive congestion. And I think your company, you've coined the concept of Carmageddon, as I remember, in 2018.
Well, what we like to say was that the roads were full of cars, but they weren't full of people. And so even though we do make vehicles designed for owners, owner occupied vehicles, they're not driven anymore. Shared mobility was a major theme, and in fact, it led to a whole new class of vehicles. So the normal idea of the shared mobility might have been like a minibus or something, but we thought we could do a lot better than that. We thought we should make it very, very comfortable, that you could go and do your work, that maybe there was 6 to 8 people. We actually worked with your company to make sure that you could match the demographics. So if you got into this bus, you were likely to meet people who were actually quite interesting to you.
Remember the interiors, the colours, female, male, safety, all those things we went through?
Yeah, well, and we did use AI to try and do the matching and got our feedback, and we discovered that actually if you offer people a service that's cheaper than a taxi, more expensive than lowest common denominator public transport, people find it compelling. They say, well, why would I want to be driving in a car, not able to do my own thing? So they started using shared mobility even before we had the AV technology ready.
Yeah, we talked about vulnerable road users before, but one of the other huge user groups of a connected and automated future are the disabled.
Correct.
Mobility impaired people, the disabled, the aged, who are disconnected from the community as a consequence of a lack of mobility options. So that's one of the wonderful outcomes over the last decade. We've seen a whole sector of society re-engaging with society because they're now reconnected with society.
So there was actually a really historical moment. That's what it's now, nearly 25 years ago. Google, in about 2015, they did the first autonomous drive on a public road with no human supervision, and the passenger was a blind engineer. And if you can go back, I think it's still on YouTube because YouTube just is the record of civilization. the way this man expressed the freedom and the liberation, that he didn't have to be thanking a human, or that like he could just command this thing to do it. He said it just changed his life, right? And now of course everybody has access to that kind of technology. And you know, from day one we made sure our vehicles were as good as they could be. But lately, you know, if you remember that these things are robots, the floors can move. If someone's not very strong, you can actually help them with ramps and arms that help lift people.
I love the fact that the taxi drivers and the Uber drivers are now the concierge in these vehicles. So instead of sitting up front in front of a steering wheel, they're actually helping a member of society that needs that help. And are actually the concierge service.
Yeah, so
correct.
The job growth that's occurred as a consequence of that's quite remarkable.
So there were unexpected jobs.
So again, it's about the paradigm shift. But I would like to hear from Carola in terms of what do you think the government have learned in terms of the energy space from that point?
Yeah, I just want to come back to what we said before, the convenience and having the right mode of transport that is fit for purpose. I remember the time in 2018 where I lived in Coogee, worked in the city, and it would take me an hour to get from Coogee into the city because I was using a public bus that was running along light rail construction, and it was just a mess.
To a schedule that didn't make any sense to you.
Exactly. And people are being cramped into a bus. You can't even do anything on your phone or computer because you're standing being thrown around in that bus.
And there's the diesel fumes as well.
Exactly. And now we actually have the choice where we can say, okay, I can still have a normal mode of transport. I can have a fast service, and everything is actually catered to the user, to the end consumer. It's not a company providing transport and you have to take whatever they offer. It's you actually being in control, choosing the mode of transport and the way you get to places.
One of the good things that happened in New South Wales, Transport for New South Wales actually in 2017 started trials of on-demand buses. Actually, it was on-demand public transport, but it was these smaller vehicles. So I think you just missed out, because I think Bondi Junction got it first, and I don't remember what happened with Coogee. But that actually gave a lot of private operators the, how can I put it, the courage to run that service when they realised that people found it compelling.
Right. I actually got a question from a listener, and Brad is asking, with all this discussion that we have about energy and what have you, as I mentioned with the government, do you think that they need to develop a centralized energy services in Australia? And how do we fuel these AVs in terms of the increase of the demand of energy? Would that see a cost variation in terms of increase or decrease?
Yeah, so we've obviously seen over the last few years that energy has become a lot more decentralized. We're also not being reliant on that that eastern seaboard grid. Like, we have smart grids, we have microgrids, and everything is working for purpose. If you want to charge your car, there is a solar charger somewhere. If your company has solar on their rooftop, they actually allow you to charge your car during work hours where it's parked anyway. Dean mentioned before, there will be petrol EV charging stations where they have super capacitors. It's super quick, the batteries are there. So there's, again, we're catering for every use case that you might come across with your electric car. And electricity really is like air or water. It'll be available because the sun always shines. We have abundance of renewable energy. So there's never a lack of energy available. It's about how we manage the energy, how we transmit energy and bring it into homes and cars, and vice versa.
So looking back into the past, what year do you think it was when the storage became so cheap that it was compelling to go to renewables?
I'd say that was in 2020 probably. So there were a lot of people who obviously bought Teslas and batteries before then, but they are the people who really embraced technology, and price didn't really matter. But if you look at where batteries have come in that time between like 2018 to 2020, that's
so.
Quite a big difference.
In your opinion, over the years that you've seen, do you think the government should have been involved more in terms of setting up those charging, or less? In your understanding?
I think, even at the risk that I sound like a politician, I think it would have been great if the government had done more, simply to alleviate all this anxiety and people not taking up the technology. We could have done it a lot quicker. We have fallen behind. At the time in 2018, I guess Australia was 8 years behind other markets, 8 years behind. So we could have done that a lot quicker. And government is always there to invest in infrastructure and spend money. But I also agree with what we said before. We need the spending to go into the future, into the smart energy, the smart infrastructure. So that you have to fix like the issues that stop people from going about their daily life, but you also need to prepare for the future.
That's interesting. It's mirrored in the problem that we've got in 2032, and that is that public transport was serially underinvested through the whole period. Now, we knew in 2016 that Australia was probably going to have to move to a regulated asset base for roads. We knew that, right? Of course, do you think COAG could agree on that? No. Do you think what do you think happened? It chipped away. A number of different toll companies owned little bits of road. Different signage.
Well, we ended up with some states where if you drove around, you got a weird bill based on what they thought was you'd leave Western Australia and you'd be sent a bill in the post saying, we think you've travelled 740 kilometres on these roads, as indicated by video, right?
But just to finish it off, so what happens, you probably saw last week, we are going to move after 14 years to a regulated asset base. We're going to actually sell the national highways and sell the arterials. The reason is we have to, because that's the money we're going to use to build the public transport that we should have invested in 2018. Because if we'd done it then, we would have connected AV to mass transit.
Yeah.
But what we've ended up with is a completely privatised outcome, which, it's okay today, but, it's 2032. I've just seen the population forecast for 2050. Melbourne and Sydney are both going to be 10 million people. Can you imagine that? I mean, even the bedrooms that you've got moving down the road, you're going to be moving pretty slow. I reckon you might be able to have a bit of a sleep in them, Dean.
Yeah, well, we also invested in flying electric vertical takeoff and landing.
Yeah, I know.
So we're
very smart.
Yeah, and now with the batteries, we can actually go Sydney, Melbourne in those things.
Yeah, and that was one of the big things that we discovered on our test beds, because we took a 3D environment, not a 2D environment, and what drone capacity, what freight capacity did the airspace have over our road corridors? And it's now developed to not just a freight capacity space, but a passenger capacity space for different trips and an emergency services space, all in the airspace, 3D dimensions of our road corridors. And that's been a big step change.
Yeah. I started speculating in airspace over roads in the early 2020s. It's fantastic. You
get these people going, but the skies are going to be crowded, and you say, okay, whatever road system you had over Melbourne, it's like, it's full. I'll make another one at 1,000 metres. Oh, that got another one at 2,000 metres. How many levels do you want to stack, right? And it's go, but they'll all run into each other. I said, well, at least when you're in 3 dimensions, you can go up and down, right? On the roads, it's actually much harder.
Yeah. That fundamental research, that science and the rigour that went in from 2018 on, when the national government decided they were going to invest the 2% of the 26 billion per year into proper scientific rigour around this environment, that was the step change.
Well, much as I hate to say anything positive about Uber, they did do a white paper that fundamentally looked at the long-term pricing and costing of these electric flying aircraft. And it's half the price of running something on the road because they don't touch the road. The only infrastructure they use is a slightly bigger car park.
Yeah, the more we discuss about this, the more I'm hearing, and I'm really thank the government for investing in their test bed, because it is so important for us to have that miniaturized type ecosystem to test all these type of requirement, and the energy, the vehicles, the infrastructure.
But that was only a SOP because they couldn't get their act together. Their institutional frameworks, and they're still completely out of date. Well, they had to be seen to be doing something. I'm sorry.
But Corolla was right.
At least you waved the flag for them.
Yeah, but Corolla was right. In 2018, we were between 5 and 10 years behind the rest of the world, and we were in danger of actually being disconnected from a technology-enabled future.
That's the point, yeah.
And once you're disconnected, you cannot reconnect. It's over. So we're right on the cusp of that in 2018, 2019. Unless we catch up and get connected, we will be, a third world nation.
That's right, and that was so important that actually the government did.
So I think about all the engineers and people with advanced manufacturing skills that were laid off when the car manufacturing stopped here. If it had not been for just a few green shoots and a little bit of government support and some really brave private sector people, we would not have built a base where we were actually capable of building autonomous technology or groundbreaking electric vehicle technology. We just would
globally exported, global skill sets.
Correct. We just would have been customers, and you go, but how would we pay for it?
For 15 years, I've been asking the Productivity Commission, the government, to get the Productivity Commission to create an industry structure and a framework, a regulatory framework for mobility, as distinct from public transport here and road freight over there and private vehicles over here, so that we can actually take the next steps. And Michael, how could a government go for this long with your research and knowing what they knew, but not able to make the institutional changes?
It's one of the unique arrangements for Australia as a federation, where we have 6 states, 2 territories that actually independently have legislation, laws and powers.
Wasn't there about 700 pieces of legislation or something?
They need to act collegiately. There is a will. In 2018 there was a will nationwide to get the digital infrastructure right, and it took that enormous step of actually acting collegiately and funding and supporting a nationwide 6 testbed arrangement across the country that delivered the step change. So there's been confusion and disaggregation of intellect and capacity before that point, and that was the aggregation moment. As Carola correctly said, we were in fact behind, and we're now a leading edge company. Dean's company, a leading edge global entity, exporting skills, predominantly software, but also vehicles.
Well, actually, one of the things that was interesting, I think what scared people and gave them courage, was that our neighbours in New Zealand, unencumbered by the state system,
were outperforming us. That's right.
Basically did a whole bunch of pilots. They were doing road user pricing in the 70s, and the world did not end. So actually the New Zealanders did a lot of experiments because they didn't have that extra layer of government, and they basically showed us the way.
And maybe even Carola, the energy industry being such out of control, was in those early 2020s?
Yeah, there were obviously the old structures and incumbents trying to prepare for that whole transformation that we've seen in the last 10 years, and they were a bit slow in getting on board and helping that transition actually, but in the end the market always prevails. And in this.
So how many energy companies did we lose? I lost track of the number of incumbents that went broke.
I think there's probably 1 or 2 of the big incumbents left, but it's more competition through decentralization. There's actually at times, in certain circumstances, no energy retailer required anymore, because there is pure peer-to-peer trading, and we don't need to have this extra layer of administration. So it's really more of transmitting the electricity, making sure that within microgrids or bigger grids we remain the stability of the grid, that we have the security, but it's not really who you buy it from, whether that brand is blue or orange or... Yeah.
Thanks for that, Carola. Maybe I'll take a pause here, because we got some polls that just come in, and maybe for your interest, panelists, we've got the listeners suggesting that, when we talked about what are the barriers to the uptake of autonomous vehicle, 30% say it was cost, another 30% say it was accessibility, and 20% actually don't trust it. So that's interesting. We have 80% being with those 3 main points. And most of the listeners believe that 2030 and 2035 will be when these autonomous or highly automated vehicles will be in use. So that's an interesting point. Any comments?
Well, the trust issue will be overcome as we progress down a testbed environment to enable the community to touch and feel and see. It'll also address the affordability issues, because the private sector will start to blossom and see opportunities on these test beds to develop an Australian industry and Australian smarts. So that's our next platform to deal with those issues. The community those numbers, Dixon, correctly reflect the community's views.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's 20, 30 or 35 away. You know, in the United States, they'll have level 4 vehicles on their interstate network in 2019.
Yeah,
you can read a book while you're driving.
Yeah.
So,
2019.
So
Not in Australia though.
No,
we're not
that's
ready.
Right. We're not ready.
We are not ready.
Yes, correct. We have got many questions that's come in for the panelists, and actually I'll just pick one because we will in the interest of time as well. Some of those questions you may already have answered, but I'll pick one out from Tamazi. Believe that the question is, Queensland creates an electric highway with DC chargers from Cairns to Brisbane. Is there any plans for South Australia to create something similar? And what do you think would be the priorities? Tamazi has 2 EVs that didn't have any problem whilst driving the city, and there's no anxiety from those travels. But maybe just comment on what have we learned and whether or not these electric superhighways are necessary for Australia.
So one of the things we found, in the old days, people thought they had to have one vehicle to do everything. As this shared mobility and mobility as a service came on, you go, well, look, I've got my vehicle I use a lot in the city, and I might buy that. It might make sense to buy that. Not so much today, but maybe 15 years ago.
20% now. It's only down to 20%.
Yeah, and if I need to go to the countryside, I'm just going to use your company to get the appropriate vehicle. And if it needs a range extender with old technology or something, well, so be it. But you don't. If you only do one trip to the country, every 3 months, and the rest of the time, so 1 week a year you're driving to the country, and 51 weeks of the year you're driving in the city, why would you buy a large vehicle designed for the country? It doesn't make sense.
But the electric superhighway, if it exists, is one of these fundamental infrastructure issues that we've got to deal with. Do we physically put an electric superhighway in, like the Cairns to Brisbane exercise, or do we use next generation induction charging or next generation solar charging? How do what is that investment? What is going to happen?
If we hadn't put that in, and I have to say back then in 2017-18 that was obviously groundbreaking and it was new. If we hadn't put that in, we would not have the choice of cars, the confidence of the consumer to actually buy them. So I think we had to do that at the time. Yes, obviously now in 2032, it seems a bit, that's like 50 kilowatt fast chargers from Cairns to Brisbane. But no, you need to give the market the confidence and empower the private sector to work around it and come up with business models around these fast charging stations.
So what is it now then? So if that was the model back in 2017-18 where we had charging points up and down a motorway, what does it look like now?
We still have that. We have a variety of on-road dynamic wireless charging. We have super fast chargers. We have your home charging because electricity is available everywhere. It is, as I said, I think earlier, you don't really need to worry about where you're going to plug your car in or where you get your electricity from. The car gets it, and you have a subscription, and that's all you need to worry about. But back then in 2017-18, that was a great project.
Thank you, Carol. Just to also maybe this is the last question, and we'll try and wrap it up. Maybe just to hear from you in terms of a last question. Do you believe that we will continue to change the way we commute from what we've learned since 2018 to now and into the future?
We will not change, and the reason that we will not change is because the infrastructures will not be built to accommodate change. And if I could just give you a great example, we cannot mode shift to public transport in the peaks because we cannot build capacity. And so if you looked at any infrastructure plan in Australia right now, it would tell you that by 2031, and this is with all of the extensions in Sydney and Melbourne, the overcapacity problem is worse. So that cannot happen. The only options, as we sit here with underinvestment in public transport, are for AV road base, which is probably likely, and active transport, which is my preference.
Yep.
But AV road-based AV, unfortunately, will be incredibly attractive, and our research would tell you that AV road-based will take people away from active transport, and that's a bad outcome.
I think, Dixon, that we are yet to see, if I look back to 2018, the whole concept of an intelligent mobility future was being explored. And the decisions in that really critical 2018 to 2020 period will really shape the future.
Yeah.
And the right decisions, as Brian correctly said, the wrong decisions mean more cars on the road, completely overloaded public transport system, a 19th century view on what a road is, instead of thinking about a mobility corridor.
Or a railway.
If we can step change the thinking to think three-dimensional corridors of mobility, not roads, that will be the step change that's required to enable the community to function in a bigger, smarter, brighter way in the future.
Thanks, Michael. Carola?
Yeah, that's. I've got nothing to add to that. That's a very good summary.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And finally, Dean?
Yeah, well, in the early days, we actually worked a lot with policy institutes and think tanks thinking about what the built environment would be like, because the built environment and transport are two sides of the same coin. So,
and that was a big change, wasn't it?
Yeah,
because you built the infrastructure and then, the communities are here, rather than an embedded, holistic behavioural system.
So back around 2015, the forward-thinking people started talking about placemaking. And placemaking was really about how do I start to basically rebuild a village and have all the services in a walkable distance. If things are in a walkable distance or with an e-bike, which is one thing we haven't managed to automate, but they're very important, you find people don't need to actually get in an AV, because it would be less convenient than actually walking. So in the places where those experiments succeeded, we saw some very positive things. But our policy thinkers are thinking it's going to be 50 years before the built environment has actually been adapted to do that properly throughout Australia. But we hope with some good thinking and goals, we will use transport when we need to, and we can use our own legs when we have to, when it's more appropriate.
Thank you, Dean. Well, thank you, panelists, for such a robust discussion we have. And thank you to our listeners. Hope this has given you some insights and thoughts about how infrastructure may interact with the advancing disruptive technologies that we have with us. Just to conclude, our next webinar is on later in July with the topic of implication for an urban land use, planning and city building. So with that, thank you all for your time, and thank you to all our listeners, and hope all of you will tune in to our next webinar. Thank you.
This is a really great opportunity to bring together the real movers and shakers of this industry.
Conferences like this are really interesting, not only for Peloton, but for me personally, to continue to promote our message of what we're doing, but also to continue to understand and take the temperature of the room of how various people are thinking about things from a technology standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from an end consumer standpoint.
Contracting all those ideas that are global are really here, and if you want to be a part of this industry, I think you've got to be at this event.
And I've really been impressed with the level of collaboration, even while they're competing with each other to go in those different directions for their own purposes.
You know, that's the value of this conference, because without that interaction with that person to tell me that one thing, I wouldn't have actually thought to myself, that's a really good idea.
As Lord Mayor of Adelaide, I absolutely had to come down here to Telstra Plaza, just out the front of Adelaide Oval, to have a look at this automated vehicle trial. This is terrific. To watch this interacting with the public space, moving people about, this is just indicative of the future.